Thanks a lot for coming. Venezuela is not an easy topic, as many of you were as we were talking before. There are many dimensions to the crisis there. At the same time that the institutions and the democracy is very fragile, the country is still very polarized between a very eager, still powerful kind of revolutionary movement and the opposition, and then these two sides often clash, and then the clashes disappear and then they come back. And I think there's no better person to brief us on the several dimensions of the crisis there than Daniel Lansberg Rodriguez. He came here last year and gave a very good presentation on this, the political, the criminal, the security dimensions of what is happening in Venezuela. So Daniel is a weekly columnist for El Nacional newspaper in Venezuela, the last independent daily there. He's also an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, where his research focuses on the political economy of Latin America. And he also serves as director for Latin America at Green Mantle, an advisory firm. So with this very brief introduction, I think the show today is Daniel's, and I'll pass the word to him.
Well, thank you very much, Antonio, and I wanted to say it's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to thank ISS for the invitation. To sort of build on what Antonio was saying, I recently had the opportunity during a international flight to watch a movie called Charade. It's an old movie. I don't know if anybody here has seen it. It has Audrey Hepburn and I believe Bristol's own Cary Grant, starring in a movie where a woman's philandering, semi-criminal financier husband runs off and attempts to board a boat from Bordeaux to Venezuela, so he can live out his millions in peace in an obscure yet tropical, paradisical place. And it struck me because one of the things that I have found as a Venezuelan in the last 5 years is that the idea of anybody willingly escaping to Venezuela as anything but a last resort has become laughable. To the point that Venezuela now plays the role that Colombia did 10 years ago, and that Mexico did maybe 30 years ago, where it's where the hero goes when they have nowhere else to turn. On television shows like Homeland, like the remake of House of Cards for the United States, when people are being hounded by the authorities and have no other choice, their escape route is Venezuela. It's become sort of, in the world's imagination, the sort of last refuge of the hunted who are willing to risk any danger to go somewhere where they might not get caught because there is no law that could catch them. And that's something that's very striking, I think, to Venezuelans, and we're not quite used to it yet. To give a little bit of background, and many of you may know this, Venezuela was, until really the 1990s, almost an exception in Latin America. At a time when Brazil was a military dictatorship, when Argentina and Chile had strong right-wing governments with problematic human rights records, at a time when Bolivia and Peru and to an extent Ecuador were having coup d'etat every several years, and Colombia had a civil war. Venezuela, other than maybe Mexico, which had sort of the pseudo one-party state, was the only real multipolar democracy that existed. It was deeply flawed in many ways. It was incredibly corrupt. There was a lot of people who did not feel that they had sufficient stake in the government, but you did have peaceful transitions from one government to another. And you had the same constitution for over, 1958 to 40 years. So that's something that was very rare in Latin America at that point. And Venezuela went from being the exception to being the exception in sort of the other direction. And I think one of the reasons that Venezuela has that reputation is because of media censorship, which was one thing that I wanted to touch on briefly. There really is no investigative journalism left in Venezuela. There is the claims of the government and there are the claims of the opposition. And somewhere in that spectrum is what's really going on. It makes it very difficult to get information out of Venezuela. Most of the people who feel comfortable writing about Venezuela don't live there because it's not seen as a safe place with which to do so. So there's a lot of caveats involved, particularly when you're looking at something like the security situation, where there is a lot of information that is coming from sources which, for one reason or another, can't really be verified easily or can't be verified publicly. So I wanted to just sort of lead with that long string of caveats, basically saying that there's definitely been an uptick in the amount of drugs moving through Venezuela. Whether that is and that's pretty much incontrovertible at this point. Whether that is a consequence of Venezuela being a failed state, or whether that's a consequence of Venezuela being a narco state, that's somewhat open for discussion. And that's, I think, what one of the questions that brings a lot of you here today. So I wanted to just sort of maybe pick 3 or 4 people to sort of talk about things that you want to discuss, or to just sort of bring up, just introduce yourself and tell me what it is exactly that you'd like. I'd like to sort of take the questions before, and then I'll attempt to answer them all and touch on all of the points of interest.
Do we have questions at this stage?
Or I can just ramble. Okay.
I have roughly 1 million questions.
1 million. Okay, choose the top 2.
So I would choose the top 2 and leave it at that. My name is Tom Wales, late of Oxford Analytica, currently of BP.
Okay.
There are sort of 2 related questions here concerning Mr. Maduro's durability in power. Which is, I think, at the forefront of everyone's mind. I don't need to tell you that polling in Venezuela is slightly problematic. There's sort of data analysis, there's interlaces, they don't always agree. It's hard to get a sense of where we are, but the direction of travel in terms of the president's approval ratings is pretty clear.
It's only gone in one direction since he took over.
They're pretty horrible. I just wonder. So there are a couple of sort of decision points that we're coming up to. Legislative elections at some point before the end of the year.
December 6th. They announced it last night.
December 6th now, and we also have maybe the following year a potential for a recall election. If you had to guess, what are the chances that Maduro actually survives both of these events?
Great question.
And what is the sort of PSUV plan, if you have any guess, as to what they do with him if he becomes even more spectacular a liability than he currently is? So that's question number 1, which is actually several questions smashed together.
You're cheating.
Yeah, I am cheating in classic fashion. The second question is also related to public opinion. There's sometimes, and this is something that you often encounter in D.C. and Florida, there's a sort of view that, well, there's somehow this kind of liberal economic flowering that's going to happen in Venezuela if somehow the PSUV loses power or something. Yes, it's completely cuckoo, but you do encounter this.
What would the morning after look like? Is that the idea?
What would the morning after look like? But my question is more specific, and that is, where do you think public opinion is on economic policy? In other words, has the kind of Chavez period, the Chavista period, so discredited the kind of socialist alternative as presented by Chavez and the PSUV, that more people are now willing to embrace something that looks more like the Colombian preference? Or is that just totally impossible? People are still very much wedded to an idea of a sort of statist, if not socialist approach to running the economy.
Great. Any others? Yeah.
Lorena Gutierrez from Difference Risk Consulting. I'd be interested in just if you could briefly comment on your vision of the Venezuelan opposition, because we've seen that it's deeply fragmented, and that's obviously enforcing the ruling party. So I'd like to see whether there's a vision for either coming to a unified front or if there are just going to be different factions trying to sort of fight for power, especially with the elections coming up in December.
Great question. Yeah.
Matthew Hunt from the Livingston and Company, we're a business intelligence firm. I have two brief questions. One is about the trajectory of corruption. My understanding is that when Chavez first came to power, he was vehemently sort of against corruption and was not himself considered to be personally corrupt. Now clearly we've got to the state where you've got the US indicting people like Cabello and others for their role in drugs trafficking and others. I've heard rumours even that PDVSA tankers are used to ship cocaine. How do we think this? What's your understanding of how this works within the government? Is it sort of officially sanctioned, or is it sort of tolerated with a blind eye turned to it? And the second question is related to Venezuela's economy, obviously importing so many goods, even crude from Algeria. How long can it really survive with its bond payments, and what's the current analysis, best guess on that?
Great. So let me go down these five, and then we can take a few more. So the first point was Tom's on the legislative elections, and I think that this is really the question that's on everybody's mind right now, because there was a lot of folks who thought that there might not actually be an announcement for legislative elections, and the fact that there was is tied into several points and several sort of interesting changes that have gone on within the Venezuelan government's basically, I think, political views over the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And a lot of this is actually, I believe, ties into the question of Diosdado Cabello, who I think is going to be one of the sort of more named people in this room today, in part because a lot of these questions will affect him more than Maduro. He's the one who's being indicted. He's the one who has been accused in the media of being the head of the Soles cartel, and he has widely been presumed for probably the better part of a decade to be one of the more sort of the larger, most developed poles of corruption within Venezuela. And the December 6th election was, I think, a win for the opposition in a sense, but from the little bit we know now, which is Diricey Lucena's basically 2-minute long announcement from last night, there's a lot of things that I find concerning. The first of which is that she mentioned explicitly that UNASUR would be there as as an accompaniment, but not as an observer, and that nobody else was announced. That's something that sets off a lot of sort of warning bells, especially because the Carter Center has historically been quite willing to work with Venezuela and has never given a Venezuelan election a bad review. The fact that they were not invited and that they were offered, I was informed this morning that they were apparently offered a role also as a viewer, but not as an observer, which I guess means you're given less access. And when you are there as an accompanier. When you're there as an accompanier, you're basically just making the political statement that you were there when the election happened, but you're not actually allowed to poke around and see what's happening inside, behind the curtain. So those are things that, to me, don't necessarily presage a particularly fair election. One of the questions on everybody's mind is whether Venezuelan elections can be tampered with. And there's long been a feeling, both within the opposition and Chavismo, that the Smartmatic machines that tally up the votes are very difficult to fudge the results. So the conventional wisdom has been for a long time that when Venezuela affects elections, it's done sort of by sleight of hand, and there's only so much you can do. So, for example, sometimes in very sort of pro-government areas, they will leave the polls open longer. and close down the polls in areas where the opposition has more of a presence. Those will close at 5, the others will be open till 8. Or you'll have a situation where the government is allowed to use official propaganda to pay for their presidential bid, whereas it tends to be minor things, and those can really only affect maybe so many votes either way. What we're looking at now in the December 6th elections is that the popularity rating of Maduro is so low that even with anything we've seen the Venezuelan government do before, it's very, very unlikely, even with all the gerrymandering, even with all the leave some polling stations open later, others earlier, it seems unlikely that you would be able to get the desired result that way. So that sort of opens up a question. Nobody really knows what the machines are capable of because the previous elections have been monitored. There's some people who claim, and I don't know if this is true, but it's what has been said, that during the Capriles election, there was a internet outage during the Capriles election against Maduro, which was very close. And that Maduro had been losing up until 4 p.m. by several 100,000 votes. Then the internet went out, and when the internet went back on, there were a lot more votes, and it tallied quickly. And that, on top of certain sort of stronghold areas being left, the polling machines being left open later, led to a very small marginal win for Maduro in the end. People sometimes claim that that's the reason that Maduro originally said that he would accept an audit right when the audit was demanded, and then the next day said, actually, we will let you recount a small portion, but we can't do a full audit. So that backtracking is something that has given a lot of people pause. But at the end of the day, unless you design the machine specifically, and those people have been very mum about what they're capable of, really nobody knows. So that's a big open question coming into the elections. The other question is if they do allow observers. And that's one of the things that the meeting between Shannon and Cabello in Port-au-Prince a couple of weeks ago, about a week ago, which I personally think was a large part of why we had the electoral announcement now. One of the things that I think could come out of that meeting eventually would be that you do have observers that are allowed into the election. So if that happens, and assuming that the presidency or that the government loses the National Assembly, what would the consequences be? So there's several. The first is Diosdado Cabello's immunity. His parliamentary immunity could be stripped from him. And that's a big potential reason why they would not want the National Assembly to change hands. There's precedent for it. It was done to several opposition lawmakers last year, including Maria Corina Machado. So if you have a opposition-led National Assembly, you can't guarantee that his immunity will remain. Now, are there ways around that? Probably. There's other positions that he could be given. He could be given Defensor del Pueblo, even though he's not a lawyer. The Supreme Court would accept it. There's different ways in which this might be able to get sidestepped, but it would be tricky to do, and it would cause a lot of questions internationally. Diosdado has famously been the Minister of Justice, not being a lawyer. He's been the Minister of Telecommunications, not being a telecommunications specialist. He was Vice President. He was President very briefly, right after the coup. He has been sort of the jack of all trades. He's been in charge of essentially every ministry but PDVSA. And as a result of that, and I think health. But if they wanted to make a Minister of Health despite not being a doctor, you would probably see that as possible. One of the things that I think defines the Venezuelan political panorama is that the Constitution is very young. And a lot of the structures in the Constitution started in 1999, when the new Constitution came about. So there's very little precedent for a lot of things. When Maduro was first running, he constitutionally should have probably given the presidency to Diosdado Cabello because he couldn't be a candidate and the acting president at the same time. The Supreme Court just sort of gave it a pass because Chavez was involved and Chavez trumps. So there's ways in which you do see a very sort of pliant Supreme Court, which allows the executive to do essentially whatever it is they want by interpreting the Constitution to their favor. Now, what's the other risk other than to the Estado of losing the National Assembly? That could change. If the National Assembly has a majority, they can technically load the court with as many judges as they want. Judges who would not be pliant, judges who would have a more pro-opposition view in how they structure different laws and different possibilities. If that were to happen, you could have a potential crisis. It could be something somewhat similar to what happened during the sort of tail end of the Morsi era, where you had a Supreme Court that was a bunch of new judges showing up for the Supreme Court and the old Supreme Court not letting them in, and that creating a lot of sort of public sort of backlash. And I think that that's a potentially complicated situation that the government's trying desperately to avoid. So where does that leave them? What are their opportunities to do so? If they can't win the election, there's a few other possibilities that they might try. One would be, for example, they could try and vote away some of the powers that the National Assembly has now. There's some precedent for this. In 2010, they lost the supermajority. And there were some things that the National Assembly could not do without the supermajority. So the outgoing National Assembly, instead of canceling the election, the outgoing National Assembly empowered the president to be able to basically work for the next cycle with a simple majority rather than a supermajority, despite that not being what the Constitution laid out. And then the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine. Whether you could do that with no majority, whether you could legislate away your own relevance prior to an opposition National Assembly taking over, again, there's no precedent for it. So it's difficult to tell, but it's the type of things that are probably going through a lot of heads in Miraflores right now, trying to figure out if we do have these elections and we cannot win them, then what are our options? So that's sort of the long answer to your first question. The second, what do I think the popular idea for the economics is? I'm actually going to merge that with the bonds question. I think that Venezuela has always been a country that's very prone to populism. During the democracy even, you had, even the Conservative Party the sort of more conservative of the two parties, COPE, they would have their people in tow and their people that they took care of. Government functionaries were expected, their salary is basically a retainer, but it was sort of understood that your main source of income isn't going to be what you are paid for your job. Your main source of income is going to be the perks that come with having a role as a government functionary. And I think that that's something that predates Chavismo and that hasn't really changed. Whether the population is very tied to the idea of defaulting or not defaulting, I think there's some of that. I think that one of the things that has kept Maduro and made him sort of reticent to really entertain those options, even while, as you mentioned, imports have become a very difficult thing to sustain, is the fact that he has predicated his entire legitimacy on having been chosen by Chávez. The idea is and it's actually a little bit strange, because a lot of times when you have very executive strong governments, what the successor does is sort of malign the predecessor. History started with me. It's sort of what Khrushchev did during de-Stalinization, right? You try and sort of take the shadow of your predecessor off of you. And Maduro has very, very clearly not done that. You go to Caracas today, and the murals are not of Maduro, they're of Chávez. Sporadically, there'll be one of Maduro with Chávez. But the idea is, I am not Bolivar, I am not Chávez, but Chávez chose me, and Chávez was infallible. His legitimacy as a leader is predicated essentially on this assumption of infallibility by his predecessor. And defaulting on the promises of the predecessor takes on a bit of a different meaning in that context. Because it can't have been a mistake to take on the debt because Chávez did. So where does that leave you? There's been a lot of moments in which people assumed, or there was a strong belief, that the government would change their policies. And one of the things we have seen is that the policies, even as they have become more and more unsustainable, as oil has crashed, during moments such as in 2014, when the opposition suddenly was able to organize somewhat and have a brief sort of period of relevancy, you didn't see the government really backing down from any of the policies that existed before. So maybe that's something that they might do after the elections if they win, or even if they lose. It might just be something that they're doing up until the elections, but at the same time, psychologically, there's this idea that there will be a miracle at some point which will keep us from having to make these hard decisions. And those miracles they haven't been coming, which I think is something that is becoming more and more of concern to the general public. Now, when it comes to the actual popularity of the president, the only other presidents that have been this unpopular have had some kind of major political backlash befall them. This is about as popular as Calderas was towards the end. This is less popular than Carlos Andrés Pérez was during, the period of the Caracazo, which was the riots in 1989 in which thousands of people died and most of Caracas, or big chunks of Caracas were burned to the ground as a result of the Washington Consensus sort of policies that were being brought on by the government that were very unpopular, and the changes in the price of gasoline, which is another reason that the government has been so reticent to change the price of gasoline, even though it's one of the more obvious things that would be able to help economically, not just because of the expenditure, but because of the thriving gasoline smuggling trade on the border that I'm sure we'll get to. So I don't think that there would be much popular sort of support a la Argentina towards, hey, let's default on the debt. For one thing, Venezuela, they've had a few defaults to companies. They've had some domestic defaults. They've had some bank defaults, technical defaults, but they haven't really defaulted. They haven't. They did a restructuring during the Latin American crisis that was agreed to by all parties, but a unilateral default on foreign creditors is something that they haven't done since oil was discovered. And that really no big oil producing nation ever has been in a position of having to do. And I think that that's something that they're keenly aware of. And they're also keenly aware of the potential consequences to default. If Argentina defaults, what does it really have to lose? It can't lose military assets. It can't lose embassies or bases. Yes, if a hedge fund wants to seize a shipment of wine heading to San Francisco to teach the Argentines a lesson, great, but that's probably not worth their time. Once you're talking about an oil tanker, once you're talking about a refinery, whether it's clear or not that those are seizable, those are some very big assets to have in play, even off of the hypothetical. And that makes sort of default a riskier proposition than the sort of stereotypical Latin American country default would be. And then sort of lastly, the recall. If there's a recall, it would involve, yes. If there's a recall, it would require the Supreme Court to allow it. When Chávez was recalled, the Supreme Court did not agree 4 times that the signatures were ready to be accepted, that they were acceptable for the recall referendum, until Chávez's approval ratings had risen. And then they approved it on the 4th try. And that's how Chávez, or in large part how Chávez survived. That would have to essentially happen again. So it all comes down to what would happen with the courts. Or if, hypothetically, the government decides that Maduro is a liability, which is something that was also touched upon during the questions. He clearly is a liability, but at the same time, he was Chávez's choice. And the government is maybe not as beholden to Chávez's infallibility as Maduro is, but it's a big part of it. Nobody calls them PSUV. People call them the Chavistas. They are intrinsically tied to the founder and the sort of myth of the founder. So basically, any situation in which they were likely to change that would be difficult. What they'd do with him in that case, if he'd have an accident and fall down the stairs, if he'd be found that all of his talking to birds had made him insane and he had to be locked away somewhere, if he had a body double recently in Panama, maybe they'll try and switch the two, a la Man in an Iron Mask. I mean, whether the PSUV would do one or all of those, it's hard to tell. They've got a mind of their own, God bless them. But I'm sure if they wanted to try and bring someone else in, they might have an option to do so. And I do think that Elias Hawa, who's one of the high-ranking Chavistas who was recently taken off of the foreign ministry and basically sent traipsing around the countryside as the Minister of Communes, building up his public image. I think that there's probably some quarters that are looking at him as a potential successor were there to be a recall referendum that then would lead to another Chavista candidacy. Do we have any more questions? Yeah. I'm gonna empower Antonio so that I have an opportunity to drink coffee.
Okay. No. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Paula Ferreira from King's College London and Venezuela as well. I have two questions, two slightly different topics. So my first question is related to kind of the crime dynamics, and arguably the government has always had kind of ideological ties with FARC and supported FARC and allegedly the illicit activities as well. However, I mean, most of the dynamics on the border are with backings and organized crime organizations resulting from the paramilitary and like other sorts of illegal armed groups. How is the relationship between the central government, if they are effectively involved in drug trafficking? How is that relationship between like FARC drug trafficking, paramilitary drug trafficking, or Bakrim? I mean, are there links there? Does it have, how does that even work? If that's not too broad. And then I'm interested in like the colectivos in Caracas. How are they mildly involved in drug trafficking as well? I mean, I'm interested in seeing like how these groups kind of interact. And then my second question would be, what about a shift in Chavismo leadership that is not as a result of the recall? And I'm asking this question because I always put to the question that as Maduro is anointed by the divine character of Chávez, it seems that his leadership is unquestionable. However, I don't think it's unquestionable within the Chavismo. And there's obviously a lot of divisions inside. And I'm asking, how are these divisions, are they a threat? Are they not a threat? And then the collectivos come in again as they were challenging the Maduro's government not too long ago. I mean, are they actually could they be a source of violence against the system? How did they play the kind of threat to the Chavismo structure?
I think I'll take the second part of the question first. So if I understand you correctly, you're talking about the sort of different strains of Chavismo and whether it would be possible to have a leadership shift as a result of something other than a vote towards a leadership or a series of votes towards a leadership shift. Is it possible? Sure. Is it likely? I'm not sure that it is for several reasons. The first of which is that if you asked me this a year ago, and I think somebody did, in this very building, I would have said it was pretty likely. But the fall in oil prices has actually had a unifying effect on Chavismo. Once the government was seen as threatened and as under threat, and once this idea sunk in that they could no longer buy their way out of problems, that they could no longer borrow their way out of problems, I think that there was a very clear shift. Where you before saw a Ramirez wing, which was a little bit more sort of the pragmatists, and then you had sort of a military Cabello wing, and then you had sort of a Maduro wing, and there were basically, a lot of questions internally as to how much should we be supporting the Cubans, what would Chavez have done here. I think that a lot of that has changed. Ramirez was sidelined, and basically Maduro gave the military everything they wanted. They have control over many of the ministries. They have had their salaries tripled in the last year and a half, which again is in keeping with inflation only doubling. But still, it's not bad, given how the rest of the country is doing. And this is going on in a situation where there's very little money coming in. So that shift in priorities, I think, has had a very strong unifying effect. I don't think if Maduro doesn't rock the boat too much, there's no reason to get rid of him. I think that none of the other players are in a position to be president, and I don't think the Othello particularly wants to be president. A lot of people disagree with me, but I don't think that that's his eventual aim, and I don't think anybody else has the military ties to be able to do it sort of single-handedly. So where would that leave a potential coup? The military, which would be required for that in all likelihood, is going to be unlikely to get a better deal than they have now. And they definitely won't get it from within Chavismo. So if they were to get a better deal, they'd have to try and get one out of the opposition, and I don't think the opposition, A, has a better deal, and B, the change in government would lead most likely to some kind of investigation as to what happened to the biggest oil windfall in history over the last 10 years, given that the reserves are completely empty. And since a lot of that went through the military at some point, I think that in Latin America, coups usually happen not because of the generals. They happen because the generals are all the president's friends. The colonels, the majors, and the captains can't get promoted because there's too many of the president's friends as generals. They overthrow the president and they become the generals. That's sort of the traditional Latin American coup dynamic. I think what makes Venezuela different is that the lieutenants and the majors and the captains have all had essentially, not all, but enough of them have had a bite of the apple over the last 10 years that the risks inherent in a complete shakeup of the system would be unlikely to warrant any promises that the opposition might be able to give them. So I don't think a coup is likely, barring some, very out there event, an earthquake levels Caracas, like happened to Bolivar, something like that. Yeah, maybe, but under just normal political pressures, I think that would be unlikely. The first part of your question, which is sort of the FARC and the colectivos, I think that's sort of the 1 million. Well, adjusting for inflation, let's call it the 1 billion.
Bolívares fuertes.
Bolívares
That's a new
fuertes,
coin, right?
Yeah. Well, it's not that new anymore. They're going to have to do a third. But there's different versions. So I don't know if any of you have read Blasi's book, Woman on Chávez, which was written by the ABC correspondent to the ABC España correspondent to Washington. He's the person who broke the Lindsay Salazar story when Lindsay first defected and when the investigation started of Bilbao Cabello, or when the investigation became more public knowledge of Bilbao Cabello, I should say. He wrote a book that reads almost like counter-revolutionary fan fiction. I mean, it is everything you could imagine. All the people you assumed were corrupt were there, and there's these speedboats full of cocaine. And in that version, what happened was that in 2002, 2003, Chavez visited with the FARC. There were negotiations between Chavez and the FARC. Chavez told them essentially that they could bring in cocaine to the country, which they did by feeding it to livestock and then moving livestock, through the border long enough for it to come back out, and that operation basically set up a relationship between the border guards and the FARC that led to all of the smuggling that we now see. That's sort of the version in that book, the short version. And if you're interested in those sorts of theories, that there's a lot of them. I very much recommend it. It's a riveting read. Thing is, and this was sort of one of the reasons that I gave the caveat at the beginning, it's difficult to tell. I mean, these are people who've defected, and to make their defection worthwhile for the government, they have to give a heck of a story. It may be true. It may not be true. I think that there's probably corruption in very high levels of the Venezuelan government, but I've never actually met one of the cows. So I feel that I can't really vouch for it. That said, the relationship between the border guards and between high levels of the Venezuelan military has led to a lot of smuggling, not just of drugs, but of gasoline, of basic goods, various types of what our countrymen would call chanchullos, which have allowed for a large accumulation of wealth and a situation where there's very little oversight. And one of the reasons I think that gasoline prices haven't been topped, because there's this myth in Venezuela that if you touch gasoline prices, the people are going to burn down Caracas, because that's sort of the simplified version of what everybody learns happened in 1989 was the gringos told the government to change oil prices, they changed oil prices, and Caracas got burned to the ground. That's sort of the the sort of elementary school story that every Venezuelan hears. At the end of the day, Chavez changed oil prices. Not as much, but he did, and really nothing happened. Countries change oil prices all the time. The fact that Maduro hasn't, I think, has to do with the amount of money that's being made on the border, having basically free gasoline given out. Maduro has been in a tough situation in which he has several constituencies he absolutely has to take care of. Because what I said about the military being unlikely to act is because they're getting the best possible deal. So you can't really cross the military. But on top of the military, there's also the sort of the oligarchs. You know, there's a lot of people who are making money mostly off Senko X exchange and off of the different deals that can be made off of the various FX rates, not off of smuggling. So you don't want to devalue because you're going to upset that part of your constituency, but you don't want to change gasoline prices because you're going to affect another part of your constituency. So it's almost like he's juggling, and he knows that at some point a ball has to get dropped, but he's waiting to see if it becomes clearer which one he can get away with doing so. So I would venture that it's unlikely that you would see that right now because there is this sort of concern that for him to act or for the government to act in the ways that might help their international reputation a bit, that might make them seem like better investments, is seen as sort of suicidal internally. Where does that leave the colectivos? So there is definitely a lot of non-state actors involved in Venezuela, which I think is something that significantly muddies the waters. You have the FARC, but on top of that, you have the colectivos. If people don't know, those are groups they actually predate Chavismo considerably. They were sort of community groups. They were very heavily leftist. When Chavez won, he had a very good dialogue with them. After the 2002 ephemeral coup against Chavez, they were armed. Depending on how you ask it, they were armed either by market forces because there were guns there, or they were deliberately armed. And again, there's two versions to the story, but at the end of the day, they're armed now. And they were very important during 2014 because nobody who was in the opposition felt safe coming out in areas sort of patrolled by colectivos, which in certain areas of the city have almost a paramilitary presence. I worked for many years in Katia, where there's a sort of particularly strong colectivo group, and they're seen by many as Robin Hood figures. And you would sometimes see, a funeral in which they would be shooting up in the air and not caring where the bullets landed, and it was sort of seen as, oh, that's just what they do. And they had sort of the impunity to do so. In Petare, there's other groups that sort of fight over various sort of patches of territory, and the municipal governments don't have the strength to really intercede. So these groups are heavily armed. When or under what circumstances they become very relevant, it's hard to say. With the Sarah murder a few months ago, which led to several shootouts with the police, I think that's something that the government was caught off guard by. And a lot of the anger you've seen in colectivo groups hasn't actually been towards Maduro, it's been towards Cabello. So that creates a very different dynamic. It's almost the sort of Aporrea, Marea Socialista tide. I would sort of lump most of the colectivos in that group. But I think by and large what they're after is preserving their status quo. They basically have de facto control over swaths of the country. The government doesn't really intercede on what they do. Are they smuggling drugs in? Maybe. I've never heard of them doing so. But the drugs that are distributed on a local level, that's absolutely something that's probably benefiting colectivos.
Let me just pause a bit and ask for you to expand on this point of potential armed actors. We have heard a lot in past years, and then that talk just became quiet, on the Bolivarian militias. Mm-hmm. That was became officially a fourth arm of the armed forces of Venezuela. So what are they doing now? And how, isn't that a huge risk of, some kind of further polarization in the country in the case of an opposition victory, because it's an entire arm of the military that is directly connected to the president and directly connected to the ideology of a Bolivarian revolution. So if there is no Bolivarian revolution in power, so who are they loyal to?
That's a great question, Antonio. Technically, all the armed forces are swearing loyalty oaths to Chavez now, so there legally shouldn't be a difference. But I think that ideologically, there definitely is. A lot of the guns that I think wound up with the colectivos probably went through the Bolivarian militias at some point. And I think that there can be a porous dynamic between those groups. At the same time, if there were an opposition victory, how those would play out, it's a terrifying counterfactual. Venezuela has not had a civil war since the 19th century, not a real one. I don't think of Venezuelans as a particularly militant people. They haven't gone to war with the neighbors since independence. That said, there's a lot that rides on how ideological truly are these groups. Is this an ideology that's predicated on personal gain, which I think a lot of the ideologies in Venezuela historically have, including the old party structures, even including a lot of the opposition parties? It is a paternalistic handout system. And the thing about paternalistic handout systems is that mercenaries don't fight to the death usually, right? They're there when there's a good shot at winning. So a lot would rely on that point. The Bolivarian militias aren't armed to the point where they could take on the armed forces per se. So if you had a democratic election, and the Bolivarian militias, I don't think are going to do what the FARC did, unless they did it to do it as the FARC does it, in which they hole up in a corner to try and make as much money running drugs as they can before somebody kills them all. But I don't see that as being something sustainable in the long term. I think culturally Venezuelans aren't programmed that way. I like to think that. Then again, it's very possible that there were Colombians having this exact same assumption circa 1940, and that never really came true. So with that sort of substantial caveat in mind, I don't think that if the opposition were able to win, I think if they won a municipal election, and if they win the December election, it won't matter. I don't think that would get really any of the major players involved, because I don't think the government would allow it if there was a real danger. If they felt there was a real existential danger, they would find some way to circumvent it. That said, if there was a presidential election that was lost, I'm sure that you would have, you might have sort of motorcycle gangs going through Caracas with Chavez banners, shooting their guns up in the air. You might have some colectivo shootouts with local authorities. But whether you would have a sustained insurrection by the Bolivarian militias, I don't think it's likely, but it's not impossible.
Excuse me. Anthony Lahal, a member here in this.
Yes.
I'd just like to ask if you've come across, or you can point me in the direction of where the evidence is of Iranian, and Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Of course, there's one I've mentioned that earlier to you, but what's the latest findings coming from? I mean, there's always that famous embrace of
Chavez's mother.
And my mother. But apart from that, and also what's happening on Margarita Island?
Great questions. So I'll start with the question about Hezbollah. You have a situation in which internationally governments that sort of see themselves as anti-status quo tend to, have a lot to talk about. Even countries like Russia and Venezuela can become quite close, even though Venezuela only has one thing to give Russia and Russia doesn't need it. They'll find ways to make deals. Venezuela will buy some old diesel submarines, because why not? Putin will give Chavez a small dog, and Chavez will walk around with it for a few weeks, and then nobody knows what happened to it. There'll always be an excuse to talk to countries that you see as being philosophically similar to you. And I think that the greatest example of that was the relationship between Ahmadinejad and Chavez, which flourished even more than the relationship between Chavez and Putin, even though I think they had a lot in common insofar as the sort of strong populist streak. They had sort of a charm to them that affected part of the country. I think that they probably had some common ground in that, but culturally they were very different. And there, I think that the biggest example is not the embrace between Chavez and Ahmadinejad, it's the embrace between Ahmadinejad and Chavez's mother. I don't know if you all know this story, but when Chavez passed away, Ahmadinejad went to the state funeral, and Chavez's mother ran up to him and embraced him, which ended up becoming a bit of a scandal in Iran because Ahmadinejad was not related to Chavez's mother. And it caused sort of considerable political fallout locally for him. So I think that there was a lot to sort of overcome in this sort of unlikely buddy comedy relationship. At the same time, for most of, I think, the last 10 years, there has been sporadic bouts, I think most recently in 2013 by Otto Reich, of claims that there is serious penetration of Islamic groups or of radical Islamic groups in Latin America that are coming in through Venezuela. There's rumors of flights between Tehran and Caracas that don't go through customs, but they, to my knowledge, have never been confirmed. Again, going back to the initial caveats, it's difficult to confirm things in Venezuela. You'll have the government version, which is mostly sunshine and lollipops, and then you'll have the sort of Caracas rumor mill. And the problem with the Caracas rumor mill is that it's not up to journalistic standards. It's I heard from someone who heard from someone who heard from someone. It's very difficult to fact check. You can't call up your local bureaucrat and ask for confirmation. And you can get in trouble for saying it. So a lot of information tends to come through Twitter. And a lot of information, like any information that comes to you from Twitter, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. I have never been told personally by someone whose opinion I trust that they have seen Hezbollah commandos traipsing around Cacahuita. Could it happen? Maybe. There has been, and this brings me back to the idea between Russia and Chavez not necessarily having a lot to talk about. Iran and Chavez have even less to talk about. There is, because, Iran can't even give Chavez submarines, right? They can trade one oil for another. But insofar as deepening trade links, there isn't that much that would make sense other than that ideological connection, other than that friendship. What that would lend itself to, it's difficult to say. I don't think that Chavez was particularly ideologically wedded to Hezbollah's cause. Whether he told his friends, sure, send some guys here, it could happen. I don't have any sort of concrete information that it has, however.
There's some congressional testimonies made, one by Lieutenant Andy Crow, another one by Roger Noriega.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've probably heard of him.
Yeah.
American Enterprise Institute. And they have said that there is definitely a Hezbollah presence. And the way it came out was when a journalist called Christiana Amanpour, she was embedded in the American military. She went to a house in Kandahar just after the invasion of Afghanistan, and there's a poster of the Iguazu Falls, and they thought, what's that doing from the tri-border area in a house in Kandahar? And that's when they started to investigate it, and they found there's now quite a presence in the tri-border area. So the tri-border area is different from Venezuela, the southern nation.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know yourself, it's lawless. They're hopping about from one to the other. So
no, I think that's. Again, there is a lot on the Caracas rumor mill to that extent, and I'm sure that, and this sort of leads into one of the sort of earlier caveats with the Salazar testimony. To me, it makes perfect sense that would happen, frankly, but I can't confirm that it has. And there's a lot of information that comes out from Caracas. There's the great quote by Mark Twain that truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to be believable. And in Venezuela, a lot of things happen that aren't believable by any conventional measure, and that would be one of them. That said, I haven't seen it myself, and there has been a lot of information that people have claimed in congressional testimonies that respected journalists have put themselves on the line for, that have then been discredited. And I know that there were some Hezbollah some Hezbollah claims that came out a couple of years ago that were discredited afterwards as well. So I don't know. I wish I could confirm your question or deny it, but I can't.
And finally, the Marguerite trial.
Sorry.
There are days.
I'd love to talk.
When I finish my thesis, I'll say it.
I would love to talk to you about it afterwards. Great, please.
I just wanted to pull you back to the legislative elections. If the polls are to be understood correctly, that Maduro is going to have to do something to improve his popular ratings. what do you think he can do, and what could he do?
Is there a second question, just to see if...
I have something to say about Margarita Island. I have like two very close sources, but okay, it's really interesting to see that this is mostly like kind of intelligence information that is like one that is mildly credible. But then obviously if it gets to the media, it gets discredited as a Caracas rumor story.
And a lot of it doesn't get.
But there is actually not Hezbollah, it's actually Al Qaeda in Margarita Island. From what I hear, obviously this comes from one from Homeland Security in the U.S. and the other one is local people, family that I know, and it's pretty obvious that they're there. And for the locals, obviously, I'm not saying as as a researcher. And apart from that comment, I had a follow-up question.
Okay.
You said, it is interesting the latest interview that El País newspaper did to Guerrillas. And although Maduro has very low ratings, it is unfeasible, it is unlikely that the Chavismo in general is that percentage, meaning that people will still vote for Chavismo despite of Maduro's low ratings. So I don't think that it is I don't think that it's that logical that because of Maduro's ratings, the assembly is largely, likely to be won by the opposition. I still think that there is a fair 50% that will still vote for Chavismo despite of Maduro's low ratings.
That's a terrifying thought. Historically speaking, the best predictor of municipal elections has been presidential approval rating, sort of dating back the last 30 or 40 years in Venezuela. If you look at the most recent data analysis poll and the most recent Consultores 21 poll, who I tend to think of as the more credible of the admittedly imperfect and deeply flawed Venezuelan polling systems when compared to, for example, with Interlace, you would have a likely opposition victory, even with the gerrymandering that's gone on, which has been considerable. At the same time, there are lots of things that can affect that, and I don't think that necessarily the idea that Chavismo will lose despite Maduro's popularity, or that the average Venezuelan is differentiating between Chavismo and Maduro in a new way, is necessarily something that I would take on as an assumption. And your question was, sorry.
It
was your question. Sorry.
About what measures do you think Maduro can take to improve the likelihood?
So the Caracas rumor mill this morning was speculating that handing over the Diosdado would be the obvious one. You hand over the Diosdado and let go of Leopoldo, and then you win the election. Again, it's the Caracas rumor mill. You never know. I don't think that that's at all likely. I think Maduro would probably not survive a direct confrontation of that nature. At the same time, I think it's telling that the U.S. government has not implied that Maduro is in any way connected to anything criminal. Only his lieutenants, only other people in the government. But the ideological strains of Chavismo have not been implicated. It's been only the more pragmatic militant ones. So I think that the fact that the U.S. government, or at least what has been leaked to the media, which again, this is not investigative reporting that has uncovered this. This has been government statements to the Wall Street Journal, right? So the information that has been made public, I think, there's probably some strategic aspect to it, which would be very relevant. What else could Maduro do? We don't know how much money he has. We know how much is in reserves, but we don't know how much is in the Chinese funds. We don't know how much is in Fonden. We don't know how much is in Bicentenario. We don't know. We don't know. There's laws now which are you're able to count things like diamonds as national reserve now. So you can put grandma's silver in there, and you can call that national wealth, and nobody knows how much of it there is. There's a great anecdote from La Fiesta del Chivo. I don't know if any of you have read it, where Trujillo is worried about a default, and he asks all his corrupt officials hey, if you all have to give back 10% of the money you've stolen so that we can pay off the creditors, so that we can avoid default, so that we can keep this going. I doubt that Maduro has that much pull, but at the same time, you don't know. I mean, I have this conversation with clients often, or with people asking about sort of default possibilities. And I like comparing Venezuela with most normal countries. It's like a chess game. You don't know what the other person is going to do, but you can see the pieces. You can see where they're strong. You can see where they're weak. Venezuela is like a poker game. You see nothing. You measure faces. You measure actions. And technically, there's a lot more risk reward that can go into poker than can go into chess. But at the same time, you're playing with much less information, and you're playing with a lot more assumptions. So I think that that's sort of what you have to keep in mind. If he has a lot of money, he can do what Chavismo has always done. He can create a bunch of new government programs. He might do what he did before and if he doesn't have the money, he might send them sacking a few large stores to see if that is enough to buttress his popularity up to the point of victory. I don't think that the sackings would be enough to get him over that hump. If he has enough money to create a brand new mission and get it going in 5 months, maybe that would be able to make that difference.
Correct me if I'm wrong, there are some signs that they're trying to sell some of these assets to generate cash.
Yeah, well, the refinery.
The refinery,
yeah.
Chalmette, Exxon. And in terms of the relationship with Iran, my understanding is that Iran's building 4 Supermax tankers for Venezuela.
That's true.
But that they haven't taken delivery yet, either because they can't afford it or because with what's going on with the US, it's just too politically dangerous for them to do.
Or because it's an attachable asset.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of that, I don't know what your view on what Venezuela's strategy is on, preparing at least for the eventuality that some of these assets. Do you know broadly what it's up to in terms of the
very quickly, because we've run out of time.
Okay, sorry. This I think goes back to one of the things that makes Venezuela so interesting is that there is no precedent for so much of this. And I think that Venezuela has shown itself, for example, with a lot of the ICSID discussions that are going on now, to be very ready to dispute what it is that they owe or what it is that they are owed. At the same time, internationally, were they to default, they have assets that would most likely be seizable. Whether that would be enough would depend on how much was defaulted on whether that default was in any way negotiated or structured. That doesn't strike me as the type of thing Venezuela would do. I don't think that this government has sort of the focus to... I don't think they default preemptively because they think it'll be cheaper in the long run. I think that the mentality of this government is more to wait for a miracle to save them until the last minute and sort of have faith that the revolution will provide. And I think that if there were to be a default, it would probably be a technical default, which could be a consequence of just that organization. We forgot it was due that day, or it could be a consequence of just not having the funds for it, or not moving the funds into the reserves in time for it. Because I don't even think that Maduro himself necessarily knows where all the money is or how much money there is. There's just too many. There's too many cooks in the kitchen.
Sure.
Yeah, too many cooks in the kitchen and too many issues to tackle. Thank you very much for coming. I think we've heard a wide-ranging analysis of Venezuela. There is the economic situation, inflation and oil falling, divisions, polarization in the country, allegations of organized crime to the highest levels. All of these factors kind of contributing to a very destabilizing scenario in view of the December elections. So I'm sure that we'll hear again from you in your next London trip, and who knows what we're going to be talking about regarding Venezuela.
Hey, I might get a chance to answer that morning after question.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Daniel.